Welcome to Insurance Suits, a podcast brought to you by AIMCO, the American Association of Insurance Management Consultants. I am Chantal Roberts.
Hey, I am Amy Johnson.
How are you doing?
I am doing well. I am
Good.
doing well.
Good.
It's getting cold, it's getting winter. So,
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So I thought we could talk about documentation, because we're always talking about things that are important. Welcome to the Insurance Suits podcast, a bi-monthly podcast brought to you by AIMCO, discussing the issues and the people who are involved in insurance. The views expressed by the moderators and guests represent their own views and opinions, and not necessarily the views and opinions of AIMCO, Insurance Suits, or its advertisers. Not only as expert witnesses, but consultants, we're always talking about better documentation. I know when I consult with insurance companies, I'm talking about that as well, sending out letters or whatever. But also as an attorney, I am sure that you want to see a lot of documentation in a file, whatever type of file that you are handling, whatever type of lawsuit, I guess I should say, that you are handling.
well, I'll tell you, it even goes beyond the lawsuits. I mean, as an attorney, I'm all about the paper, right? But, I was in house for almost 15 years as director of property and casualty claims. So my main responsibility was to internally manage our bad faith litigation and extra contractual claims. And, it can turn on what is documented. But because of the nature of those types of claims, it goes beyond claim file documentation. It hits into underwriting documentation. It goes into broker documentation. Um, I would say claim or a claim issue or an underwriting issue. If you don't take a look through your file and make sure things like communications with the producer or the broker, if they're properly documenting, those communications are going to be discovered. And if they're not in your file, that brings up a second issue on credibility and, perception and
I would
due
think
diligence.
that also leads to an E&O claim. And I know we talk a lot about claims, and I don't necessarily just mean, a claim that's been filed, but I mean like a claim that has, or maybe an allegation or a lawsuit. But it seems to me that even if there is a lawsuit against an agent, for example, you can turn that in if you have E&O insurance, and
Right.
therefore you would have a claim. So I just mentioned this to say that I don't want to always be bringing up like claims as in adjusters, but it could also be an allegation. But one of the things that you had talked about about documentation and making sure that the agent or the producer or the broker, for example, properly documents a file, is that I know as an adjuster, when I contacted a producer, whether that be an agent or the broker,
Right.
and I said, hey, I'm getting ready to send out this reservation of rights letter, because I can't find evidence that they ever insured XYZ truck, for example, or
Sure.
XYZ building, or, the producer would say, hey, yeah, that's perfectly okay with me. I told them they needed to do it and they didn't. And I'm like, yes, thank you. Because guess who's going to be the very first person that insured or that policyholder calls is going to be the producer saying, why didn't you tell me that I needed to buy this kind of insurance and blah, blah, blah. And that saves that agent and that, or that producer, broker, so much heartache. Same thing for the underwriters, if they have like underwriting regulations or underwriting recommendations or whatever the word may be.
Well, here's the thing, and I'm sure you've heard this a gazillion times. We've always said it with respect to claim files. If it's not in the claim file, it does not exist. If that conversation is not documented in the claim file, that conversation did not take place. And listen, I know as well as you do, and probably everyone else out there, if there's an insured who's looking for coverage and they're facing paying their lawyers instead of being able to get insurance coverage, a defense or anything, that insured is going to say, that never happened.
It's funny, I was just talking on, I had mentioned Clubhouse previously when I was talking to Nancy, whose interview came out on November 15th. So you can go back and
Mhm.
listen to, if you're listening to this podcast, you can go back and listen if you hadn't been subscribing and listening to all of our podcasts here at Insurance Suits. Be sure to do that. Click the subscribe button and give us a 5-star review. We don't want a 1-star review. Give us a 5-star review.
I like it.
Yep, absolutely. Anyway, I was talking about a gentleman who I have recommended to AMCO to join, Bill Otten, and he is my co-host with Clubhouse. And we were talking about the fact of documentation and the fact that if it's not written down, and we didn't even say claims file, we automatically say if it's not written down, it didn't happen.
Mhm.
Regardless of where that is. And we were talking about the fact that it is amazing how when a claim gets denied, and again, even if it's a lawsuit or whatever, it is amazing how short people's memories become.
Right. Well, you can't blame them.
No, you can't.
I mean, I certainly take issue with someone who isn't being honest, for sure. Um, but you could ask somebody 5 minutes after an accident whether a light was red or green, and they might not remember, or they might remember differently. You go a year later, and they might not even remember what intersection they were at, or they'll speculate. It really is a best practices to document. Now,
Absolutely.
how much and how frequently, you know, as an agent, there should be some best practices that are followed. There certainly is in the insurance industry, but on the underwriting side too,
Mhm.
it's important
I think
to have the file reflect your proactivity.
absolutely. I think it is really important if you're talking to like your underwriter and your producer, and the producer goes, "Hey, can you underwrite XYZ, like a barn or something like that?" And the underwriter comes back saying no, it kind of needs to be, it needs to be in both files.
Mhm,
And look, people are people, they're going to make mistakes. It's not always, you're sometimes going to have notes that don't make it into the file, whatever filing system that is, whether it's handwritten notes if you were
mhm,
really old school, or if you were working in an environment where it's all paperless. But it should ultimately be in both files so that you can independently do that. And then I always liked when, because what Bill and I were talking about a while ago was report only claims. And what should an
mhm,
agent or a producer do with report only claims? Because so often our insureds, our policyholders, do not want the claims department to get that report only claim, because for fear of a increase in premium or whatever. And Bill and I were pointing out to the producers, look, memories do fade, evidence fades, physical evidence gets lost or destroyed. Like if it was a car accident and it's just a fender bender and you're like, yeah, it's gonna be underneath my deductible or something like that. uh, and they're not claiming injury right now, blah, 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 blah. Report it, because we can send someone out there to show that there's no, breaking of the tail light, and there was no,
Mhm.
you know, streaks on the tire streaks, or, skid marks. And we can then show, or we can at least take pictures of your car, if not the claimant's car. And again, that all boils down to documentation.
Well, and here's the thing, your example is a good one because you report it to a carrier, you give the option to the carrier to, in fact, to go out there and document. When you aren't documenting, when you aren't reporting it, you take that away from the carrier. You're putting it one step closer to some kind of prejudicial impact of not even giving notice of a claim. And that can jeopardize coverage. Nobody, I don't know a carrier, or have dealt with a carrier that doesn't want to fairly and thoroughly and accurately adjust a claim.
This episode of Insurance Suits is sponsored by the American Association of Insurance Management Consultants, or AMCO, a nonprofit trade association comprised of insurance and risk professionals ranging from actuarial, underwriting, acquisition and transactions, and adjuster, agent, and broker standards of care. Find out more at www.aaimco.com.
I don't see that mentality, as a systemic component of
Despite what
claim
the plaintiff
adjusting.
attorneys and the plaintiff bar would have our policyholders and the claimants, the third party claimants, believe, I would agree with you. I find that the carriers really do want to do what's right. I mean, you've got bad apples everywhere. We're not even going to talk about that. That's a whole
For
different
sure.
podcast.
But, down the road, in the event that a lawsuit is ultimately filed, to be able to have that documentation that was done, pretty close to contemporaneously with the incident or the accident, and to be not only to protect your relationship with your carrier, but to allow that carrier to be able to vigorously defend you with evidence. And on the flip side, especially when I was in house, listen, I want to know if there is liability. Because if there is, then we're going to pay the claim.
Right. Absolutely. I have
No.
I have worked claims for the policyholder, or I shouldn't say worked claims for the policyholder. I have been an expert witness for the
Mhm.
policyholder, where I have reviewed the file, and I told retaining counsel, who would be the plaintiff counsel, look, were there mistakes? Absolutely. Again, your adjuster is going to be human. There's going to be mistakes. But is there, quote unquote, bad faith? Disclaimer, of course, expert witnesses can't say that there's bad faith. Only the trier of fact can say that there's bad faith. However, we talk in a shortcut parlance, so don't quote me. I guess don't throw this back in my face, I should say, at a deposition or whatever. But is it bad faith? No, absolutely not. It was simply a mistake. And I think that that's what ultimately any client of ours, whether it be a consulting client, an expert witness, retaining counsel, because I'm sure you, as an attorney, have retained either, I guess, consulting experts or
Mhm.
expert witnesses, and they said, "Oof, walk us through that. What's happened there?"
My expert in consulting practice, is really like a 50-50 split of carrier and policyholder. As an attorney, I generally represent insurance companies, not always in a bad faith context, but in a coverage context or just consulting. Or, I do a lot of arson and fraud investigations and help get the carrier through the process. And one thing I always ask my carrier clients is, what do you want from me to document your file? It's really, I don't want to assume that they want a full-blown report. I don't want to assume that they want little snippets, but I want to make sure what I'm providing to my insurance company client is in line with their best practices, is in line with the way they internally handle these claims. I want it to be consistent because it is important to have consistency. And, that is really on a case by case basis. To be able, sometimes I've had a carrier say, you know what, I don't, I understand your conclusions. I agree with them. I don't want a 5-page report because I've got to send this up the chain and I want people to focus on the real issues. So I know there's a lot of moving parts, but can we focus on this? Would that work? Yeah, let's do it. And if you need more, reach out, let me know, and I can give you more. But the documentation component is so important because it's not just defending against bad faith claim. It is making sure that a supervisor or a VP or somebody can pick up a file and go through it and be able to determine exactly how things got to where it got. How did you evaluate that this case is worth $500,000 versus $250,000?
CMR Consulting proudly sponsors the video recording of Insurance Suits. You now have a choice of watching or listening to the podcast. Go to YouTube and search for Chantal Roberts or CMR Consulting.
Well, it's because this document, and here we have this deposition, and here's a conversation I had with, a witness. You can document that and you can kind of insulate yourself from second guessing from, on an internal basis too. I think that's so important.
Yeah.
What have you seen in your experience with the expert and consulting components?
Well, I go into a file thinking, I put on my adjuster hat. And again, to explain to those who may not be familiar with what an expert witness or a consultant, even if I'm consulting with the claims department, I still go in there with my adjuster cap on because I work specifically for adjusting claims handling standards, practices, and procedures. And in fact, in I think about 2 weeks, we are going to have Fred Fisher on. He is an expert and consultant with AMCO. And I think he does, well, he does a plethora of things. He probably does agent stuff, and I don't, he has his fingers on a lot of pies. I'll just put that. I'll just say that.
He does. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no. And well, what I was going to say is I kind of do the same thing, is that I go through and I'm thinking as an adjuster, and I would assume that those who have been hired for the agent standards and practices go in as an agent, and they look at all of the file notes, whether that be the claim file notes, the producer file notes, if we get an underwriter out there, the underwriting file notes. I know that we have another expert, or actually we have a couple of experts that do business interruption kind of things, business interruption consultants, and they can say, yes, they did the business interruption or business income losses correctly. They figured that correctly. And I would assume that they would look at all of that documentation, and basically you're going back with 2020 hindsight, which of course nobody has 2020 hindsight when you're in the ditch and bullets are, you know, flying overhead and bombs are exploding and all of that kind of stuff. And that's what I mean when I say, did they make mistakes? Yes. Or they being the adjuster, did the adjuster make mistakes? Yes. But is it bad faith? Does it bring it up to willful and wanton kind of behavior? No, it doesn't. And that's what you're kind of looking for. And so what I am looking for is, did they meet all of the standards? You know, did they send out these 30-day letters? I often, if like the insured says, with the report only kind of claim, I want to turn in a claim report only, but I don't want you to do any kind of an investigation. And I'm like, look, it's really important that we do an investigation. It's really, really important. It could happen 2 years down the line that statute's going to run, they're going to file suit, and then we're behind the 8 ball, everything's gone, da, 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 da. And the insurer goes, nope, absolutely not. All I have to do is report it. That's all I got to do. Da, da, da. So I would send a letter saying, you told me you did not want me to. And so it's not only that conversation that I've had with the file notes, but I've also sent a letter or an email so that the insured cannot say, well, that note is just self-serving. And you know, therefore we should just disregard it. No, I sent you a letter, or I sent you an email.
And you know, you mentioned Fred Fisher. So I have talked to him about this. I mean, he's pretty vocal with his thoughts on documentation. And he has a really unique perspective because he deals with agents and brokers. And in fact, was one forever and a day. And you know, his view, he's going to be a great person to hear from on this, because his view really is document, 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 because it shows proactivity. It shows, you know, it puts some skin in the game. It establishes the relationship between an agent and the customer, the agent and the carrier. And that documentation, you know, everyone thinks about a CYA perspective, you know, covering your butt, but it's more than that. An agent has a component of customer service. A carrier has a component of customer service. Insureds are customers. He really has great war stories on documentation. He is, I enjoy talking to Fred a lot. He's got such a huge knowledge base because he's passionate about it. It's really enjoyable to hear from him.
Yeah, well, you know what, on that note, I say, let's wrap up this episode of Insurance Suits and say, join us in 2 weeks when we're going to interview Fred.
Absolutely.
And talk about, you know, whatever he wants to talk about, because he is a hoot. He is an absolute hoot to listen to. So my name is Chantal Roberts. I'd like to thank my co-host Amy Johnson for joining today. We'll be back, like I said, in 2 weeks. We'll be talking to Fred. So please be sure to like, follow, subscribe to our podcast on your favorite distribution channel, and give us a review, preferably a 5-star one, because that helps the algorithm push us out to other people. If you do need an insurance consultant or expert witness, go to www.aimco.com. Or if you're a consultant or an expert witness and you want to join us, go to our page to learn more about us. We'd love to have you.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care.